Hello all, and this video is going to be on using Wittgenstein's philosophy as an examination of culturally with the example of the digitized sphere offering up two separate systems of not just morality but overall language games within hypermodernity. And so to start, of course, with Wittgenstein's famous analogy of language operating as an ancient city with these different suburbs contained within it, where you have different avenues and paths, if you will, similar to how language in its use, re-examines the past and uses different tools in its use to objects that could have been within a different city or a different place in time, and nonetheless have different uses within it. And so, the city, in that sort of respect, could be seen as a digitized sphere, as we do in today's world, where civilization now is, within this technological sphere. And so a look at technics or meaning towards language and how the city is presented to us as atomized individuals interacting with the algorithm. And something with regards to the algorithm that I found rather interesting, although I won't necessarily commit to it all the way because I haven't completely thought this through, is the algorithm sort of serves in a similar vein to the pointing process that Wittgenstein talks about with descriptions or his discussion of pain and the signifiers such as a limp or clenching a limb or something of that nature, and to how that also can line up with how the algorithm serves as a sort of directive of a sort of pointing in online experience, especially with regards to social media and what parameters you're allowed to put yourself in, when you just let the algorithm sort of take hold and you're scrolling to the latest minute in a sort of absent-minded way. Ultimately, though, there is a directive here. There's a pointing process, and we've talked about stories or recognition of certain political problems, if you will, with regards to the algorithm dispensing of it. And so that's something to perhaps consider as well. And so our subjectivity itself, on the internet, in media online, melts away really as we see these different perspectives and the rise of point of view entertainment and stuff of that nature. And so how will that ultimately affect in Wittgenstein's philosophy towards a language game, or the example of your own subjectiveness towards a color red, if you will, and so how we experience these things actually has a process online, of course, with how we consume our entertainment now, what really fascinates us, what really brings about within our subjective stances we engage with this content. Nonetheless, you do have this sort of necessity, if you will, of reaching out beyond what is actually subjective to you in that sort of real world sense, and what's actually available to you as content in your experience online, which I know is kind of a mouthful there. And so what do these games consist of in this online sphere, where your own subjectivity is up for grabs in that sort of attention grabbing sense, and how it capitulates to you with consumption and constantly being advertised to, especially catered towards yourself. And so what are the implications for a common ground, a common world, and a common language, even within Wittgenstein's philosophy, towards these games, especially on the parameters of ideology, where you have, as we've pointed out before, especially on the channel, the sort of two distinctive realities that intertwine to some degree in real life events, but nonetheless their interpretation, how they're even sensed, I would argue, and as well as how they are demonstrated within the language game, has these two separate and what I would call digitized cities that have their own telos, if you will, their own aims, their own beliefs on what is problematic, what politically influences them towards action even. And so you have these two separate streams that are convinced that they have the interpretation of reality that is truer to the real world, if you will. And so how these rules within those games, or memetics, if you will, is also important to perhaps look at. Because if you're not actually within these ideological cities, if you will, then you're going to get A, either left behind, or B, you won't even actually be able to recognize the conditions within it, and to actually come about with any sort of solution, or but really it comes more down to just simply being left behind. And so the notion of the centrist, if you will, if like the bridge between these two cities, I think is defunct really in this current state of affairs, because the answers, the signifiers, if you will, and even the rules within these language games between these two cities, if you will, are contained within the actual structure itself, and therefore you can't really have a middle ground because of the necessity of the common world necessary between the two cities is greater than this sort of rational notion that you could find a sort of middle ground. And so in a lot of ways, if we were going to introduce Marshall McLuhan and his idea of media and the message and the different forms of entertainment with regards to hot and cold media, and I don't want to get too in the weeds here with a discussion on which the internet really is, or different electronic advancements, if you will, throughout the last century or so with regards to that. But I do want to offer up that perhaps there is hot and cold messaging within these ideological camps where unless you're actually within these thought structures, then you're really hung out to dry, simply because so much of our media has this sort of insinuation, if you will. And so if we're going to look, culturally at the internet, for example, with an entire real genre of content creation where, you just kind of like look at the other side and you ask yourself, well, how can these people even inhibit the same world that I do? And, there's a lot of innuendo and signaling within, let's just say left and right wing politics. If we were going to name these actual, cities, although I don't think that this historical binary is, I believe that the technological advancements, of course, is much more important. What should be the privileged over what the actual convictions of the camps have to actually say. Because, as Wittgenstein points out with regards to the lion not being able, even if he was to speak a common word with you, he still doesn't actually comprehend or have the embedded language structure necessary to actually get meaning from it. And so you'll be just talking right past them because of concepts and examples like pain that he talks about. And so as these city structures continue to stray away from a sort of agreed upon moral sense, if you will, and they are further within their own ideologies, then one could wonder if we're reaching a time where to each other we have become lion-like in that example, to where we can no longer understand what we truly mean to each other and have this sort of common ground, even when it comes to problem solving, but much more than that with morality and the implications that could come from believing truly that there's no reality to common ground with or have a common place with. And so people learn, of course, within language, or embed themselves in language which is rooted, and then further, as we see with these in the digital sphere, within these thinking structures towards conviction. And so just as sense data is compiled within the sciences to generalize out, as Wittgenstein's background with his relationship with science, especially in his early writings. And so if they're divorced from bare life in this sort of sense data, Wittgenstein, of course, points out that essences, or these general statements towards these, trying to create a logic or formalized system out of sensory data, then you're failing to get at bare life, bare data sense, insofar that understanding really language as a grammatical more than an actual proposition of essences. And so, of course, if we're taking that within his philosophy, then this is how we can suppose, within this video here, of how, both ideologies put forth these, different propositional answers towards existential questions, or of course in pragmatism with policy ideas or whatever the case may be. One could see with a relationship with the algorithm, as I mentioned earlier, then how would you go about understanding the correct use of not just essence or logical sense, if you will, but in the common themes and common world shared with each other online. And so, just as Wittgenstein points out about, making a private language, if you will, if you had a description for pain as the example, but in here so far, I'm putting forth that, in a sort of, digital sense, we're actually able to, go forward with these so-called logical propositions, counter side by side with each other, despite the fact that, they both actually exist within their own city structures, as the analogy is going along here. And so you have, shared implications of, something like pain even, or, political interest when it comes to the digital sphere and, online with, symbolism and memes, if as it were. These actually act upon as a sort of presupposition in the grammar shared around with pain within these ideological frameworks. And so, when we talk about things like, sending signals or sending messages, within media, we can see how, both can inhibit at the same time, despite the fact that they're able to, move forward with their propositions, even if they are counterintuitive towards each other, because the criteria of correctness is, in a way, supplemented with, in this digital sphere, with these constant different perspectives, not just represented in a sort of ideological sense, but in an actual sort of real sense way. And we see this culturally all the time with the popularities of, sense manipulation, such as with, ASMR, or if you want to go for the more vulgar one with, regards to pornography usage and things of that nature. We're tapping into sense and extraordinary news clip stories constantly, where we inhibit someone's sensory output in a sort of brief, obviously very fast and satellite driven way. And so we're able to tap into these perspectives where you could have 50 to 100 smartphone cameras angled all at the same event at the same time, and through those perspectives you can actually come to a different understanding of these events. And I think when you look on a list of a stream, if you will, of a current event, and you have the typical multinational media corporations, and Fox being the conservative one, so-called, and MSNBC being liberal, as an example. And they give their framework on these current events as they're happening in real time, and nonetheless they're still able to go forward, even though you would think that one would trump over the other as being more representative of the real world, quite literally. But this doesn't really seem to ever happen, and instead we continue to signal to each other within these moral frameworks. And as an example, something like immigration is not even allowed to be put up for grabs within liberal circles now, of being detrimental to a nation state or a people or a culture. And just as the right has certain sets of propositions that they put forward where you would consider it no deal, quite literally. And so both have these moral frameworks that increasingly are devoid of actually having a common ground, because they actually inhibit a different perspective through the digital sphere within their own language games, as technology continues to go forward and our language games continue to shift with regards to how our relationship with technology as a whole continues. And there's been recent developments with a sort of simulation of presence, quite literally, with AI chat representing other people that are actually aren't being represented. And so what is the actual concreteness or corrective in these games put forth by these two ideological camps? How can they find commonality, and what is ultimately manipulated in the online sphere, in the increasingly digitized suburbs, if you will, within Wittgenstein's analogy? And so to cap off this video with a couple more thoughts going forward with Wittgenstein's philosophy here, and how I think going forward culturally we'll continue to see this never-ending divisive struggle here, because of course they are able to exist at the same time, despite the fact that they quite literally don't want to coexist, and where that will eventually lead us in the future. But I hope you guys enjoyed, and give this some thoughts on this sort of footnote video on Wittgenstein and some of the developments culturally and certainly technologically. But thanks for watching, guys, and I hope to see you for the next one.